aftermath of a hip fracture in hospital.
Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion House in Mexico in the oil painting cave's mouth. Today I'm just starting on some rock shadows.
And we know from multiple studies that amongst elderly couples, when one of them is hospitalized, the other one is much more likely to die. Or that when one of them falls ill, the other one will have suppression of their immune activity. Why? Because the cardiovascular system, the nervous system, the immune system, the hormonal apparatus is actually modulated and kept balanced by our emotional relationships with other people. That's biopsychosocial. Now, if you look at early life now, and if I have time, I'll tell you how these early patterns or early emotional experiences actually result in cancer later on. But let me just tell you one simple fact. From a Canadian study, if you were abused as a child, your risk of cancer goes up nearly 50%, regardless of smoking and other factors. What's the connection? That's the subject of my talk. But again, it's a biopsychosocial perspective, which I think is the only scientific way to look at things. So, let me now come back to early experience. I was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder when I was in my mid-50s, or early to mid-50s. And, the diagnosis really, for me, it felt like a relief because it seemed to explain so many of my dysfunctions in personal life, and always being late and always being disorganized, and having trouble paying attention if I wasn't interested, and all this kind of stuff. The hallmark of ADD, not its only symptom, but its major symptom, is an automatic tuning out, an absent-mindedness. In other words, a dissociation. By the way, we tend to categorize people according to diagnoses, and we have this belief that there's the diagnosable people over there, and the rest of us normal people over here. Well, I got news for you. What I've noticed in myself and throughout my practice years is that there's a continuum. And some people have the symptoms severe enough that we can diagnose them, but that doesn't mean that they're over there and the rest of us over here. There's actually a distribution of virtually any pattern throughout the population. Some people just have it in a higher concentration. Now we can diagnose them. But let's not think that the rest of us are that different. Anyway, so I was diagnosed with ADD and this tuning out. Well, now the medical belief about ADHD or ADD is that it's a biological disease of the brain, because we're fixated on biological diseases these days, and it's caused largely by genetics, which I never bought into for a minute, despite the fact that 2 of my kids were diagnosed. So there's proof. Father's got it, the kid's got it, it's got to be genetic, right? No, it doesn't. I mean, none of my children became doctors. But if they had, would that prove that the practice of medicine is a genetic disease? I mean, sometimes it looks like it might be, but obviously things can happen in multiple generations where similar patterns are developed without any genetic input at all, or very little genetic input. But the reason I didn't buy into the idea that this is a genetic condition is because I understood something. By that time I knew something, that the tuning out, the absent-mindedness, is not a disease, genetic or otherwise. What is it actually? Why do people have the capacity to tune out? Why do we have that? Why did nature make our brains automatically tune out sometimes? To cope with stress. In other words, it's a coping mechanism. It's a coping mechanism. So now if you look at the burgeoning number of children being diagnosed with this and that disorder, with the fact that the number of prescriptions for ADHD has gone up, as of 3 years ago, it had gone up 43% in the previous 5 years in this country. When you look at all the kids who are being diagnosed with ADD, ODD, OCD, oppositional defiant disorder, pervasive development disorder, autistic spectrum disorder, reactive attachment disorder, all these disorders, and all the kids who are being medicated, and sometimes they're being medicated with antipsychotics. Antipsychotics! We have no idea what the long-term impact of antipsychotics will be on the developing brain of our children, because those studies have not been done yet. But we're giving them because we don't know what else to do with them. Why don't we know how to do with them? Because we're not looking at the whole picture. That's why. So at Children's Hospital here in Vancouver, they've had to establish a special clinic just to deal with the metabolic side effects of the antipsychotics in kids. What's going on? It can't be genetically driven, because genes don't change in a population over 10 years, or 20 years, or even 100 years. So if we're seeing many, many more kids with troubled behaviors, it ain't the genes. There's something going on in our society that's causing that. As to what it is, since if you're looking at the simple example of ADD and the tuning out, knowing that the tuning out is a coping mechanism, and it's a way that the brain deals with stress, when the stress can't be handled, then the question we have to ask is, what is stressing our kids so much in our society? What's actually going on a social level? Now, if I can give you the example of Windsor, Ontario, which in the year 2000 and 2009 saw the number of childhood and adolescent mental health visits go up 50% in 1 year. In Ontario, Canada's largest province, we're seeing the same pattern still going on. Now, what happened in Windsor, Ontario in 2008, 2009? What happened was that because of greed on Wall Street and short-sightedness in Detroit, the auto industry was in trouble. So the parents were stressed. So the kids are being taken to be diagnosed and medicated. So because of social, economic, and cultural factors, more kids were being diagnosed and medicated. But it's a biopsychosocial event. Yes, their brains are involved, but their brains are being affected by what's happening in the society around them. And, you know, I'm not going into a lot of personal history, but as to why that might have tuned out as an infant will be apparent to you if I tell you that I was born to Jewish parents in Nazi-occupied Hungary in 1944. That was my first year of life. So, 3 years ago, February of this year, in the journal Pediatrics, official journal of the American Pediatric Association, the following article appeared from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. The article is entitled, An Integrated Scientific Framework for Child Survival and Early Child Development. And here's what they say in their abstract. Growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. In other words, the way young children adapt to early stress, to early distress, helps them endure those initial difficulties, but those same coping mechanisms become sources of pathology later on. In other words, something that's meant to be a temporary state becomes a long-term trait. So, as an infant, given what I just told you, without going into any details, you can see why I might have spent a lot of my time tuning out during my first year of life. Let me read you a quote here, and this is very pertinent to your work. And you can imagine my mother's emotional states after her parents died in Auschwitz. And she had an infant to look after, and my father was away in forced labor. The child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother, of anyone else he's with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. The organism does not develop the confidence that it can regulate itself, that things will happen as they should. If the pain and frustration continue, they will have a disintegrating effect on the organism, and the child will begin to experience organismic fear for its very survival. So if the mother suffers, the baby suffers too. How do babies deal with that? Well, one way to deal with it is to tune out. But when are they tuning out? Let me continue with a few quotes from this article from Harvard in the Journal of Pediatrics. And when I talk about evidence-based, this is the evidence I wish they would teach in medical schools and nursing schools, in schools of education, in schools of psychology. But I'm telling you, I know for a fact that at UBC, medical students still don't hear this stuff. And this is not new knowledge, it's not new science, it's been around for a couple of decades. I became aware of it in the 1990s, when I wrote my book on ADD, Scattered Minds. But this article summarizes the accumulated evidence. Here's what they say, and this is why your work is so important. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. Let me repeat that one. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth. In other words, already stresses on pregnant women will have a significant impact on the brain's physiology and psychology of the fetus. You can stress pregnant animals, it's been done in the laboratory in the second trimester of pregnancy, and when they're adults, they'll be more likely to use cocaine and alcohol to soothe themselves. You can wean rats 1 week early. 1 week early. They'll be more likely to use drugs later on to soothe themselves. We know from many studies that when women are stressed, that has an impact on the stress regulation, brain circuitry of the child. Lots of studies. I mean, there's probably 4 dozen studies that I could cite for you right now if I went to that section of my computer. So, an interesting thing is, that when I've given this talk or similar information in First Nations communities, I'm often told, in our community, there's been a rule for hundreds of years that if a woman is pregnant and if somebody's angry or stressed, they're not allowed to go near that person. They're supposed to deal with their anger and their stress before they go with the pregnant woman because they don't want to transfer it to the baby. Now they knew this without ultrasounds, brain scans, blood tests. And that's what I mean about being disconnected from my intuitions. There's so much wisdom in intuition and traditional knowledge that science is now validating. So, this process begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and so, that's why, by the way, and I'll say more about addiction later, but in my book on addiction, in the appendix on prevention, you know what I say? The prevention of addiction has to begin at the first prenatal visit, by taking care of the emotional needs of the mother. And then they say that this process establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning and behavior that follow. The next paragraph, and this is key. The interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. In other words, for the development of healthy brain circuits, what we need is relationships between infants and the adult world that is mutually responsive. And by mutually responsive, by the way, that fundamentally means that the adult world has to be exquisitely responsive to the child. And that means that anything that interferes with the capacity of the parents to be responsive to the child will interfere with the child's brain development. And I'm talking about not abstract psychological development, I'm talking about the amount of dopamine that will be available in the child's brain. Dopamine is the incentive motivation chemical. When my drug-addicted clients shoot cocaine and crystal meth, they're literally trying to increase the level of dopamine in their brain. Dopamine is what makes us vital and curious and alive and motivated. That's also what we give to kids with ADHD, is Ritalin and Dexedrine to elevate their dopamine levels. But guess what? The dopamine circuitry develops in interaction with their relationships. So that if you separate young animals from their mothers, that'll diminish the number of dopamine receptors. If you put monkeys in isolation, adults, that'll diminish the number of dopamine receptors in their brains. They'll have less dopamine activity. They'll be less motivated. They'll be able to pay less attention. If you take infant monkeys and measure their dopamine levels in the front part of the brain, and then you separate them from the mothers, and you remeasure the dopamine a week later, it's significantly diminished. In other words, the chemistry of the child's brain depends on the presence of the mother. And not just the physical presence, but the emotional presence, the responsiveness of the mother. So I'm talking about the physiological circuitry of the brain. So what's happening, I contend that what's happening in our culture, that because of many, many factors, cultural and economic and social, parents are no longer as available for their kids emotionally. And kids are not growing up in the right environment because it was never intended that kids should spend most of their time away from the nurturing adults in their lives. I mean, throughout human history, throughout prehistory, throughout evolution, through millions of years of evolution, and certainly hundreds of thousands of evolution of the human species, and throughout human prehistory. And until very recently, through most of human history, children spend their growing years around the nurturing adults in their lives. But they no longer do so is a recent phenomenon. So when you actually look at what happens in our culture, where extended families, clans, tribes, and communities barely exist anymore, where the nuclear family itself, there's a 40% of the people, the kids are being brought up in single-parent families, and they don't see their parent the whole day, from a very early age on. What do we expect? And the parents are very stressed for all kinds of reasons. What do we expect but that there should be a lot of kids with troubled brain functioning? And then we say they have this biological disease. Well, yeah, but what causes the biology? It's the psychosocial environment and the way it affects the development of the child's brain and the child's personality. So it's biopsychosocial. Then there's the birth process. Now, as you know, those of you that are midwives, you're probably gnashing your teeth over this one. But the cesarean section rate in British Columbia right now, anybody know what it is? Is it 36%, 37%, something like that? More than a third of women cannot deliver vaginally anymore in this province. Now, so what? Baby comes out anyway. Really? Nature does not make too many mistakes. If it has a certain way of doing things, there's a reason for it. Birth, as you're probably aware, is not just a mechanical event of getting the baby out of the womb. Birth is also a way of getting the baby ready for life. How? Because during the natural birthing process, both the mother and the baby receive what has been called a love cocktail of chemicals that include oxytocin and endorphins and other chemicals which promote bonding. That doesn't happen during cesarean section. Now, there are some really good reasons to do cesarean sections. Probably about 7 or 8% of people are going to have cesarean sections under the best of circumstances, and that's life-saving for child and mother. But 37%? What does that talk to? It talks to the way that my profession is educated, which is sort of crisis-oriented and disease-oriented, rather than how do we promote natural processes. It also speaks to a deep alienation of women from their bodies, that they're actually scared of their own body functioning. And this is not deliberate, this is a cultural artifact. It's the way we live, we get disconnected from ourselves. And so then that shows up in the fact that over a third of children no longer experience that love cocktail, which doesn't mean that it's over and nothing we can do, but it does pose another risk for that child's development. And then we know from animal studies that the early bonding is so important for the development of crucial brain circuits, and I won't even go into the details of the studies just because I don't have time. But let me tell you, even at BC Women's, my niece, whose eldest daughter is 14 years old, was lying on the second day in her room postpartum, or post-birth, and with her newborn daughter on her belly, and the nurse actually came in and said, "Don't overdo it, you're going to spoil her." Well, there's no excuse for that in the 21st century. You can't spoil an infant. And then we tell parents, when the baby cries, don't pick them up, let them cry it out. I used to tell my women this when I was a family practitioner until I found out better, but I was so convinced, because, if you want the baby to sleep through the night, when they cry at night, don't pick them up. They'll go back to sleep. Sure they will, because they give up. They disassociate. It's too painful. And what have you taught them? You've taught them that the world doesn't give a damn. And here's the thing. Those early experiences shape how we view ourselves. So, if I look at my own life, and why I became a workaholic doctor, and I really was a workaholic doctor, which meant that I got a lot of money, and a lot of praise, and a lot of appreciation, right? We get rewarded for all the wrong things. But why? Because the message I got as an infant was that the world didn't want me. Now, how did I get that message? Because my mother was so unhappy throughout the first year of my life. How could she have been otherwise? But infants take everything personally. Young children take everything personally. So, if the mother's unhappy, that can only mean that she doesn't want me, or there's something wrong with me, and I have to prove that I'm worthwhile. Well, one way to prove that you're worthwhile is to go to medical school, or nursing school, and become this great helper, always available for other people. And what does that mean? In the case of my children, it meant that they had a father who wasn't available. So they were stressed by that. They start tuning out. Now they're diagnosed. Now we think we have this genetic disease. No, we don't. What we have is multi-generational trauma being passed on from one generation to the next. And in the Global Mail today, there's an article about suicide amongst teenagers in a native community in Manitoba. And I'm quoted in the article. That's why I know about it. Well, if you look at what happens about multi-generational trauma transmission, we have a case-controlled example in our First Nations communities. When I worked in the Downtown East Side, 30% of my clients were First Nations origin. In our jails, 25% of the people are First Nations. They make up 4% of the population, 25% of the jail population. Why? Because their culture has been destroyed, because their families have been traumatized, and that trauma is passed on from one generation to the next. And that shows up in the suicide rate. And that shows up in the addiction rate. And that shows up in the rate of child abuse. Because we do pass on our traumas. And given what I've told you about development, that it's biopsychosocial, when you're traumatized, that's going to have an impact on your health. So if you look at the large-scale studies, such as the adverse, and I'm going to ask you, How many of you know about the ACE studies, the Adverse Childhood Experience Studies? Please put your hand up. Adverse ACE studies. Raise your hand really high so I can see. Okay, that's pretty good, and it's horrible. It's pretty good that there's even 15 of you that knows them. It's terrible that all of you don't know them. And it's terrible not about you personally. Please,
Alright, so as you can see, that starts defining some of the stones in the foreground, middle ground, leading up into where they'll be diffused by light. And all of it will be reglazed with a lemon to give the distance stone shadows a little bit of overglaze of yellow as well. But that's as far as I can get on this video clip. I guess I can zoom in and show you some of those details. Starting to look pretty gnarly.
The Adverse Childhood Experience Studies looked at large-scale populations.
There we go.
They looked at childhood experiences and adult outcomes. Childhood adverse
so it's getting a lot of fun texture and play in the light and shadow.
Emotional, physical, or sexual abuse.
That's it for the moment. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion Taos, Mexico, working on an oil painting Cave's Mouth. Thanks for watching and have a good evening, Earth.
There might be one or two others. For each of these adverse childhood experiences, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially, the risk of mental illness goes up exponentially, the risk of autoimmune disease goes up exponentially.